Okay, good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone to the November edition of From the Field, the Farm Chat with Idaho Wheat. Whether you are here live, and I'm very happy to see some familiar faces or names, I guess, in the participant list, or whether you're listening to our recorded version on YouTube or on a podcast platform, we're very happy to have you here. I'm Casey Chumra. I'm the Executive Director of the Idaho Wheat Commission. And from our office today, we also have Garrett Dudley, the Research Manager, and Brittany Hurst Marchant, the Communications and Education Manager. And we'll probably have them asking some questions later. Our goal with these webinars is to cover relevant topics in 30 minutes or less, including plenty of time for questions. So please feel free to type those in the chat box at any time. And at the end, you can also raise your hand with the raise the hand icon, and we can turn on your mic if you'd rather do that. And we also love getting grower suggestions for future topics. So please send those our way at any time, whether that's now or afterwards. We have a great topic and a great guest for you today. Dr. Howard Neibling is a water management engineer and extension specialist at the University of Idaho, and he is stationed at the Kimberly Research Center, and he's going to help us perfect our final irrigation in wheat today. So Dr. Neibling, thank you so much for being here today, and please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you. This is a topic that I've worked on several different times over the course of my career, and so it's one that's really important and will get to be more important as we move on, in the next few years, I suspect. So I'll just go ahead and start sharing my slides, and we can go through some ideas about how you approach the last irrigations on wheat. And so we're talking about perfecting that final irrigation in wheat. And I think to start with, we need to look a little bit at how the crop water use pattern in wheat, what it looks like. And so here we have winter grain starts off with it's already started in the fall, and so by the end of March, it's starting off and using quite a little bit of water, and then it peaks. And then it drops off sharply. Spring grain takes a little longer to develop, and then it also peaks and also drops off sharply. So what we're really wanting to focus on in this presentation is this area right in here, right at the very end. It's always a hard thing to look at because you've been watching your wheat crop use water at a very high rate, and then all of a sudden the switch flips and boom, it quits using water. And so you would like to be able to catch it right here and then catch it as it starts dropping off on water use, so that you don't add water that you don't need to add, and so you don't end up creating disease conditions as well. So we're going to try to focus on that last part of the crop water use season. But just to give some perspective, some of the major growth stages in cereals are that in the vegetative stage, except tillering, some stress tends to shorten the plant. In tillering, the stress limits the number of heads that you're going to have. And, by height of about 6 inches, it's already determined how many tillers and how many heads there are going to be out there. And if it's stressed thin and reduces the number of heads, you can't make that up later. Flowering, the stress limits the number of kernels. And then in yield formation, which is what we'll be talking most about, stress would result in incomplete head fill and limits kernel size. If you're looking at the general water use pattern for two-row malting barley or hard red spring wheat, for example, emergence to milk, you see there's quite a bit of water use there, 14 inches to get it to the milk stage in hard red spring wheat. Milk to soft dough takes about 2 more inches. And then soft dough to hard dough takes approximately an inch, 8/10 of an inch. And then hard dough to harvest is about 1.2 inches. If you look at these two numbers here, this is kind of the foundation for the recommendation that we typically give. And that says that if you have 2 inches of usable water in the soil, at soft dough, you can cut the water off. And this is part of the information that we use to base that on. Right there's our 2 inches. And part of this also depends on how much soil you have to work with, because if you're in an unrestricted root zone, wheat will root down to about 3 feet, and it will pull water anywhere from the surface down to 3 feet during the season. So this is a pretty good sized reservoir. If you have a deep soil, you can store several inches of water that's usable for that crop. But if you're on some of our shallower soils and only have about a foot of usable soil, there just isn't that much there in the crop reservoir, and so you're going to have to operate just a little differently. You may need at least one more irrigation after soft dough. So basically, if you stress a crop at soft dough by about 1 inch of stress, you're going to get about 9% hit on maximum yield. And after soft dough, there's very little yield impact if you had that 2 inch of water in the root zone. If you have 1 inch deficit across the entire season, that'll give you about 6% of the maximum yield. Now, for late season, when can you shut the water off? I did some studies with a graduate student in the early 2000s, and then Chris Rogers and I did this set of studies, later in, not that many years ago, where we looked at randomized plots out in the field and did timing on the cutoff. Basically, what we were trying to do, and this kind of shows what we do. This was on a barley experiment over at Burley a number of years ago. When we shut the water off, we had good water in this area in the top 60 centimeters, which is roughly 2 feet. And then as we shut the water off and the crop continued to grow, you could see that it dried out from here to here. That was at, and then it dried out on down. By the time of harvest, it was dried out. It really pulled the water from this water content clear down to this water content in the surface. It pulled it in the 2 foot range clear down into here, and it was actually pulling just a little bit down into the 3rd foot. So this is the water that we were using after we cut the water off. I did some work on drip for several years, 97, 98, 99, and 2000. And you can see kind of an interesting pattern here. If I cut the water off at early milk, we had about 70% of maximum yield. If we were about 10 days before soft dough, and you don't really know that exactly till you get there, but if you're 10 days before soft dough anyway, you're about 90% of maximum yield. At soft dough, we had a lot of scatter. Statistically, this one, and this one were no different. But in general, if you cut it off at soft dough, you had essentially maximum yield. In this one, we had 10 days after soft dough. Actually, looks like it gave the maximum yield. And this was on drip, and so that would be like surface irrigation. And we typically would see that on surface irrigation, you can water a little bit later because you're not wetting that vegetation late in the season. On sprinkler irrigation, our results were highest at soft dough cutoff. And then, here, this one would drop way down because we had black tip infection that year. This was back to malting barley. Again, a very similar pattern. Soft dough, 2000 to 2002, or soft dough cutoff was the maximum yield in that particular case. Post soft dough typically tended to drop off just a little bit. And we also had, in that case, we also made grade on, everything from milk all the way to post soft dough on barley. I wouldn't recommend doing that unless you really had to. Black tip is also a good consideration. Percent of the infected kernels when we cut it off at milk in 2000 was 3% infected, soft dough 4% infected, and post soft dough 9% infected with blacktip. And so I think this is one of the major considerations here. The yield from many different trials is essentially the same if you have 2 inches of water that you can use after soft dough. But then you have some negative effects on soft dough, post soft dough, in terms of disease, and also in some cases in terms of reduced test weight. Okay, that was from our later study. What I wanted to do here was to basically just highlight a little bit of the things you should consider. Like I talked earlier, the root zone depth in inches makes a big difference. If you've got a 12-inch root zone in a sandy loam soil, you have about 8/10 of an inch of water. Well, that's not 2 inches, and so you're going to have to add some more water after soft dough. If you've got a light textured silt loam, you got an inch, so you're still going to have to add an inch. And heavier texture, basically, if you've got a 12 inches of soil to work with, you're going to have to water after soft dough. If you have 2 feet of root zone depth, it doesn't quite do it in general on silt loam soils. Light or heavier textured silt loam soils, 2 inches can be stored in that 2-foot profile if you water and fill the profile right about soft dough. It will have 2 inches that you can use after that. If you have a very deep soil, and I've had some of these too, then you can cut off on a sandy loam soil, no problem, and no problem on the others as well. So taking this table and then kind of flipping it over and saying, okay, how many inches do you need to irrigate past soft dough if you don't want any yield or quality reduction? If you've got a 12-inch root zone, you're going to have to irrigate a little over an inch, and so forth. An inch here and about 8/10 here. If you've got a 24-inch root zone, a little bit on sandy soils and nothing on any of the others. So this gives you kind of an overview of, for different depths and different textures, how much water you may have to add after soft dough. And I think that's probably one of the more useful, simple little tables to do that. The other thing that you do need to know is you really need a good feel for how much water your machine is putting, your irrigation system is putting on per hour, so that you can confidently say, okay, if I want to add an inch of water, how do I do it? How long? That might be a couple of revolutions with a pivot on heavier textured soils, or maybe one on a lighter textured soil. The thing I really encourage you to consider is that if your target is to add 8/10 of an inch of water, you need to set up your pivot so that it will add probably a little over an inch, because the numbers that you get for water application on your pivot charts are all what we call gross irrigation. That's the amount of water you pump, and that would be spread out over the land surface. We lose, typically on a pivot, we lose about 20% of the water to evaporation or wind drift. So if we put on an inch of water, we don't get an inch into the soil. We only get 8/10 of an inch into the soil. And so that's something that you really need to consider in all your irrigation management, is that, the numbers on your pivot charts are always gross irrigation. You need to multiply those by about 0.8 to get a good idea of how much is actually usable getting into the soil. That's something that can make a big difference. And so basically, the general findings, you can stop at soft dough if at least 2 inches of usable water can be stored in the root zone. And many times that'll save one to two irrigations relative to what we typically do. And that's basically done from wheat in 97 to 02, barley that same time period, and then 15 to 17 with Chris Rogers as well. So that all those studies basically have exactly the same message. after soft dough on shallower sandy soils like we showed before, or you could go back and look at those curves that I showed you and say, I just don't have that much water, and I have some potatoes over here that are really thirsty. And so that curve would also show you that you could cut water off before soft dough and have about 90% yield. And that water may be a whole lot more valuable on a potato crop. And so that gives you a little bit of information to look at some trade-offs in how you might use limited water as well. And so watering past soft dough doesn't improve yield. It may reduce test weight and protein. It may increase black tip infestation, and it can leach some nutrients, and it can waste water and energy. We have this bulletin 912 is, I think, a very good bulletin, and I would encourage you to take a good look at it as well, because it has a lot more information in it. And we talk about soft dough. Well, what is it? This is a nice little picture. Basically, when you squeeze the kernel, it's a doughy consistency that comes out. And these pictures are kind of a nice case of that as well. So with that, I should probably stop and address any questions that you might have. This is something I've really enjoyed working on and talking about, because it makes quite a difference in water savings, and it can also be a big help in producing quality grain without disease problems as well.
That was great. You've got so much good information in there in a very short amount of time. I think you're right. It's doubly beneficial when you can kind of maximize your yield and maybe save some money. So that's great. I would encourage everybody to put some questions into the chat. I'm also going to put a link in the chat to that updated bulletin that he referenced. I actually have it sitting here on my desk. There is such good information in there. So I would encourage everyone to check that out as well. So Garrett, maybe do you want to start us off with a question? And then if anybody else wants to raise their hand or put one in the chat, we'll entertain those questions as well.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dr. Neibling. When I've staged grain for final irrigation, I always struggle to determine that soft dough stage.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could touch a little bit more, maybe describing what I'm looking for there in that kernel when I roll it up in my hand, just really what I'm looking for to determine that soft dough.
That's a great question, and I wish I had a really concise answer. I did some work a few years ago trying to look at maybe timing it, looking at growing degree days after a particular crop stage, and it had some promise, but it still gave about a 5-day window. And so that's another, I would love to have something like that said, okay, so many growing degree days after boot, for example. Well, we're working on it, but we're not quite there yet. Soft dough is, well, one way I tend to do it is I would take a kernel and I would make an indentation with my thumbnail, and if it bounces, and if it comes back to the undeformed stage, and then I open it up and squeeze it, and it's not real milky. So you squeeze it, and if it's milky is kind of a very fluid. It has open fluid in it. Soft dough is, there's no real free water or fluid. It's just kind of a doughy kind of consistency, and in my mind, it's a doughy consistency, and yet it's soft enough that when you stick your thumbnail into it, it bounces back. When it gets to hard dough, it won't bounce back. You indent it, it stays indented. And there are some other people that have used another not exactly elegant description of it, and they say, well, it's sort of like the zit stage. And that's not far off either, really.
So more of a putty.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great description.
A moldable putty.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I guess the follow-up question on that, is there is there a certain number of days that you could plan ahead? Say, I'm thinking about a situation where I'm thinking about moving water to a different crop. I've got potatoes and I'm planning ahead. Is there kind of an accurate way to predict the number of days before I get to that pre-soft dough or soft dough stage where I know I've kind of maximized my water use?
Let's see. It's going to vary year to year based on how hot it is during that period of time. I would probably key on something like the milk stage. And you go out and you're at milk stage and you're probably going to be at soft dough, probably within a week. And so week and a half. But that all again depends on the temperature. And it reminds me, I think I may want to go ahead and dig out some of those old slides that I had looking at the timing on days after flag leaf, and just send them to you, just for you to see what's there, and if it might be worth sharing. That's a little bit of a good predictor. Actually, I think I had some slides on there that kind of gave a general timeline after, as you went through, about how many days or how many heating degree days it took to get from one stage to the next. And I will dig those out and share those with you.
Okay, great. Do you
And
find
I'd like
that
to remind everyone there's a little hand raise icon. So if you'd like to raise your hand, we can also turn your mic on. Otherwise, Garrett, if you have some more questions here.
I guess one question, do you find that most growers are scheduling that final irrigation based on that, getting out in the field and actually looking at that soft dough stage? Or is it more, what, I've got one pass in a couple days and I know I've got to move my water? How do we make decisions there?
It's like a lot of other things. There are a lot of trade-offs in what you do. If you have a lot of flexibility with your water, you can really fine-tune this. And particularly if you're under a pivot, so you can make the whole irrigation within, a day and a half to 3 days, that's a lot easier to fine-tune. Now, let's say you've got a hand line or wheel line that it takes you about a week to 10 days to get across the field. You'd like to try to time that so that most of the field is, watered about right, but you've got some looking ahead to do there and say, okay, well, if I'm going to be at soft dough here in about a week, I'd better get going on my last irrigation. And it's honestly kind of an art. And I know at home, we had different fields that behave differently, and everybody learns how their own fields behave, and you do that, and you learn over time how you handle each field and how sensitive each field is. It's a little bit of an issue. It's honestly just some trade-offs, and I think the good thing about it is if you look at those curves, they're fairly flat. You could be, a week before soft dough and you're still getting 90% plus yield, and generally the quality is up there as well. So if you're about a week before soft dough, everything I've done, you still have about 90% of yield, and you still have good quality as well. And unless it's just a terribly hot time period. And so that gives you a little more flexibility if you've got some of these things that say, well, gosh, I'm tied down to my equipment.
So you don't have to have it exactly right. You've got a little bit of wiggle room.
You have some wiggle room. And, some of our new varieties are maybe a bit more durable than some of our others as well, it seems.
There's a good comment in the chat from Hans Hayden too, that the last irrigation also can influence lodging, which is another consideration, that since that can cause loss and expense.
That's an excellent comment, because every year you can drive around the Magic Valley or other places, and you can kind of pick out places where people, just didn't feel comfortable stopping on time, and they put one more irrigation on and down it went. And you can see that every year on some cases, and some cases, no matter what you do, it's going to lodge, but that still kind of lets you hedge your bets a little bit. Excellent comment.
Great. Okay. Well, I have not seen any hands raised or other questions in the chat. So I think we'll give everybody one last chance here. Otherwise, we will thank Dr. Neibling for joining us today. We are kind of at our end of our 30 minutes and just really appreciate this great information. And we will get all of the recordings posted, also a link to that bulletin again in the YouTube description. And we'll see if we can get more people to see all of this great information. So really appreciate it.
Well,
Thanks,
thank you all.
everybody.
Thank you.